Good morning, everyone. Thank you to the EEB for inviting me, and thank you all for listening in. Okay, today I'd like to ask you a question. Given that the most important aspect in a sheet or a shirt sustainability is how many times it is used or worn, is an environmental footprint label what consumers really want or need to make informed choices that are better for them and better for the planet? Today I'm going to try to provide a whirlwind tour of some of the concerns that suggest it may not be in exactly 10 minutes, so we can't get into details. But if anyone wants further information on the various aspects, links to the data sources, etc., these are on my website. So let's start at the top and work down. Sustainability information used to guide textile and apparel choices, encouraging the purchase of more sustainable fibres and fabrics, discouraging the purchase of textiles and apparel deemed less sustainable, will, by definition, reduce the demand for the latter. That is the object of the exercise. But textiles and clothing are sourced predominantly from the global south. Farmed fibres constitute the primary cash crops of millions of global poor, and indeed entire countries. For example, cotton generates over 50% of Benin's export income. So should the EU PEF advise consumers to buy or not to buy Benin cotton without considering the socio-economic impact on what is one of the world's poorest countries, and where 80% of the population depends on agriculture? And the same concerns apply to other farmed fibres, such as silk and alpaca. And what about cultural impact? Sheep are a vital part of Navajo cosmology, as are alpaca for the indigenous people of the Andes. Should consumers be advised or not to buy Navajo churro wool or Peruvian alpaca without considering this? The statutory minimum wage in the largest garment-producing countries is estimated to be less than 50% of that necessary to secure a decent life. Should consumers be advised to buy or not to buy a garment without being told whether the worker who made it was paid a living wage? At the moment, these concerns are not addressed, and the entire focus is on environmental impact, which is regularly conflated with sustainability. But since the Brundtland Commission in 1987, the Global North is committed to not view the environment as a sphere independent of human needs, and to prioritise the needs of the global poor in all sustainability decisions. The EU's own website states, "We are committed to implement the SDGs in all our policies." The EU PEF, by definition, has to uphold that commitment. How can it if it addresses none of the concerns that I have just mentioned? This is particularly true if there is no consensus on the environmental data that is being provided. And unfortunately, even if we restrict ourselves to looking solely at environmental considerations, there are still major concerns. Now, the first is that in a democracy, if consumers are going to be told that one item of clothing is more sustainable than another, they have a right to be able to examine the source of that information. Disadvantaged producers likewise have the right to know upon what basis they are being penalised, and to contest it if they wish. But there is no open source, peer-reviewed database of fibre and fabric impacts at the present time, which means that in the immediate future, data for the EU PEF or other labelling will have to come from privately owned databases, such as the Qantas-owned WALDB, or the Blackstone-owned Sphera Gabi, or the MSI, which used to belong to the SEC, but is now owned by HIGCO of Delaware. These databases are all more or less behind paywalls. For the HIG MSI, for instance, you can see the normalised scores in Higgies per kilo, which is why I'm going to use the MSI as an example in what follows. But you cannot see how those scores were arrived at. There is no public oversight, no accountability, no system of redress in any of those indices. In a democratic society, is it acceptable for the state to use such databases to direct consumer purchases? The second set of concerns is technical. You can only compare LCAs produced using exactly the same methodology and boundaries, but there is no suite of LCAs for global fibres satisfying this condition. Existing indices are comparing scores based on studies using different boundaries and different methodologies with predictably inconsistent outcomes. Quick aside for an LCA primer here. Firstly, when you want to choose between one process or product or another, you should use a consequential LCA. That's an LCA that measures the impacts of the producers at the margin. So if, for instance, consumers are told viscose is more sustainable than cotton, what is the impact of the marginal producer who will stop growing cotton? And what is the impact of the marginal producer who will start or increase production of viscose? To my knowledge, there are no consequential LCAs of global fibres, and everyone is looking at attributional LCAs. Attributional LCAs tell you the impact of the average producer. It is self-evident that even if the average producer of any given fibre has a lower environmental impact than the average producer of another fibre, the same may not apply at the margin. Secondly, many inputs and outputs are co-products. For example, raising cattle produces meat, dairy, manure and hides. How do you allocate the impact of raising that cow or steer over the various co-products? Well, there are a number of options. The first is economic allocation, where impacts are allocated to each co-product in proportion to the contribution that they make to the lifetime value of the whole. And then there's biophysical allocation, by protein, say, where you allocate impacts between meat and wool, for example, based on their relative protein content. And then there's system expansion. This is normally used in consequential LCAs, and that's where you look at what the co-product could or does replace, and you deduct the impact of one from the other. The problem is that each of these methods will produce very different outcomes for the same set of input data. The Higg MSI, for example, uses economic allocation for all farmed co-products except wool, where impact allocation between meat and wool is by protein. For silk, Higg uses economic allocation. Now, if the MSI used allocation by protein for silk, as it does for wool, the purported impact of silk, based on exactly the same production data, would fall by 60%. Similarly, in the LCA behind Higg MSI for organic cotton, manure was treated as a worthless waste of another system, so it comes impact-free. In the LCA behind the silk MSI, manure was treated as a valuable co-product of livestock and comes with hefty environmental impacts attached. The raw material global warming potential, GWP, in organic cotton production is 1.3 Higgs per kilo, and eutrophication is 3.88 per kilo. For silk fabric, those numbers are 78.8 per kilo and 577 per kilo respectively. That is a massive difference in purported impact. And since the recommended manure applications per hectare in India for cotton and mulberry trees are not dissimilar, this is due almost entirely to the fact that different boundaries were used. It does not reflect a real difference in impact between the fibres. Similarly, economic allocation is just one small line in a report. Whether allocation is 1% or 2% looks unimportant, but choosing the latter will double the impact values. A real-world example of this is the Higg MSI for leather. Generic hides have an economic allocation of 3.6%. For the hides of the world's largest meat packer, JBS, the MSI uses an economic allocation of only 0.87%. That reduces JBS's impact scores for hides reared in exactly the same manner as the average Brazilian hide by 76%, and according to the MSI, makes JBS the world's most sustainable cowhide producers. Or, as JBS put it, Kind Leather has just been awarded the best score in the industry on the Higg Material Sustainability Index. Consumers have a right to expect that the information that they are given is the truth and the whole truth. Would many feel duped by the PEF if it used indices like the MSI and they discovered that the leather that the PEF had declared the world's most sustainable had, in reality, been produced by an entity recently accused of contributing significantly to illegal deforestation in Brazil by both the New York Times and by Bloomberg? In the same vein, Textile Exchange informs us that 16% of global organic cotton currently comes from Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan in the Aral Sea basin. Might consumers who selected organic cotton, bedding or clothing, believing that it consumed 92% less water in cultivation than conventional cotton, as claimed by the MSI, and so the PEF, feel that their politicians had knowingly misled them if they then discovered that they had in fact purchased Aral Sea cotton, produced with some of the highest and most inefficient irrigation in the world. Yet another concern is that at the moment impact is measured up to the factory gate, but clothing and textiles also have important impacts in use and disposal. All fabrics shed fibres, and plastic microfibres in particular, are increasingly seen as an environmental and a health hazard. The EU's own Scientific Advisory Committee, SAPEA, recommended that the use of plastics be mitigated for this reason 3 years ago. Are EU consumers considering purchasing polyester clothing or carpets entitled to expect that their legislators should warn them of this? Polyester is not currently commercially recycled fibre to fibre either. Would the EU Commission be misleading customers if the PEF claims recycled poly from plastic bottles is more sustainable without noting that the item itself cannot be recycled? Finally, as I pointed out at the beginning of this presentation, the most important consideration for textile and apparel sustainability is not impact in production. It is impact per use or wear. If a consumer chooses one shirt over another because it has half the environmental impact in production, when they would have worn the alternative 10 times more, climate change will be increased, not reduced. The consumer will be potentially wasting their own money, and waste will be augmented. How can the PEF or any other labelling system transmit this vital piece of information? And given all of the above, should the EU be telling consumers to focus on production impacts at all? Or should consumer sustainability labelling advise citizens to focus solely on extending the number of wears uses per item, whilst minimising any adverse impacts in wear, use and care? Thank you so much for your time.